Testing. Initial thoughts. Cryptocurrently, episode 0.5. Gonna kick it off plain and simple. So, a lot of people, there seems to be a conflation between what money really is, where value is derived from, how currencies transact with one another. All this uncertainty, all this confusion makes for a very difficult landscape to navigate. It's very hard to inform people about the pros and cons of cryptocurrencies, or the pros and cons of digital currencies versus physical currencies, what you should have and for what use case. It's very difficult to go about that conversation when we really don't even have a strong fundamental understanding of, what money represents. Okay, so let's start there, right? The trade system, the initial trade system that existed in the universe in time and space, was barter of services, barter of energy, barter of resources, etc. This barter system, however useful, became relatively taxing when population growth started to scale. So, simplifying that a little bit, the more people there were, the harder it was to move mass amounts of cattle and this, that, and the other. There was too many parties subject to, attempt to maybe raid your resources or intermediate unnecessarily in your transactions. So, in cases like gold and silver, gems and such, it took a large convoy caravan. And if you think about it, like the Persians and stuff, like they had elephants to move. They had war elephants. You're thinking like massive beasts to move across the land. So like it wasn't just horses and cattle and oxen. It was there was a whole ecosystem built on the back of how would you call it, caravan animals. So in that system, barter works very well because you have something of value, right? Work that you can prove. Maybe you're an artist, maybe you're a blacksmith, maybe you are a carpenter, etc. You have work that you can prove that you require compensation for to go in exchange for other services. You're a carpenter, but you're not a seamstress, and you need clothes to go to work. So you would initially carpenter for a seamstress. They would make you the clothes, and that would be the transaction. Maybe a receipt would be produced in a ledger in the sense of taking note of the transaction, but that is the fundamental essence of a transaction: a service for a service, a good for a good, or a good for a service, or a service for a good. So in that landscape, we have to develop something that we can use to represent the total value, the sum of our values, in a smaller denomination. Thus, currency started to form. And if you look at history, there's been a varying degrees of what is considered currency. It's usually what is the most valuable resource to the indigenous population. So you could take the glass beads example or the shells example. Even Turkish lira, they don't really have a value to a degree now, but they did. They were just extremely inflationary. So these different currencies all played a role in emboldening trade because it quantified how much you could say you had. In a sense, you didn't have to physically prove that you had X amount of cattle, but you could say, hey, look, I got X amount of cattle. This token here represents 10,000 cattle, okay, or 100 cattle, or whatever be the volume of coin per sheep. So again, we have this denomination system where we use a currency to represent a product or a service or a good of some sort. So the conversion rate might have been $1 to 100 sheep, and every dollar you give, you get 100 sheep. But that doesn't mean that the value is arbitrary. A lot of people like to say that the value is arbitrary. The value is based on what's relative in the economy. So if you need a shit ton of sheep to produce the wool for your business so that you can make more money, that is a priority in your closed economy. So you want to get access to that. That means that your value, you have valued that, not arbitrarily, but based on what makes economic sense to you, because that is how you're feeding yourself. So if you go back to that exact phrase right there, how are you feeding yourself? How are you sustaining yourself? If artists are sustaining themselves through art, they will go and proffer art fans and try to have them contribute to the art, or have the state commission an artwork so that they can go and, put that work out while still taking care of themselves. And that's a huge detachment from what exists in society now. Whereas people might have aspired as a child to be a great artist, actor, writer, philosopher, these kinds of abstract things, there's a little bit of a disconnect from reaching it now, because you have to actually there's an oversaturation to a degree, and so it's very hard to come out and be new and original in such a diverse population of things that could exist now. It's not nearly as possible, and without that being kind of propelled from a fundamental basis, people aren't going to really lean into that. They're going to lean into what makes more economic sense. And a lot of people talk about this in the sense that, your job isn't dependent on what you want to do. It's dependent on what makes the most money in an economy. And that's why a lot of people were talking about learn the code when the truckers were having their issues, because it was making more money than trucking. And for the effort put in, you probably would have made more money. And that's a huge factor as well. What's worth the time? Because if your time is being converted into pennies on the dollar, you're wasting your time. But if your time is being converted, every hour is worth $10,000, your personal value goes up, but your actual individual value is higher than others. So that's just the fundament of transitioning from barter to currency, because now we have a way to represent the value that we hold in the economy. So let's kind of slow down, break these two concepts down. We got the barter system and we have currencies. So the barter system itself is just the transactions of services and goods between willing parties. So as long as both parties are willing and nobody's trying to underhand the other, they can transact. Same thing is true of the currency formation. If all parties willing, they can transact. And let's not go deep into the whole reserve banking idea, having the gold and reserves and deposits, etc. We kind of get that from a general standpoint. As long as the parties are willing to transact, they can use that money as a transaction basis. Now, why is a coin, a currency, that is backed by the state, that is physical, different from what people are coming to realize as a central bank digital currency? Well, I think if you use this equation, it makes it a little bit simpler, but there's central bank digital currency and there's central bank physical currency. What we are currently using is central bank physical currency, and what we are transitioning to is central bank digital currency. Now, a lot of people say, well, the government can keep up my transactions and it's no more privacy, no more. Well, bro, I hate to be the bearer of what I think is obvious news, not necessarily bad news, but we've been in a surveillance state for the better half of 20 years, since 9/11, I would say. And so if you really are concerned about your privacy and your security, it stands to reason that you should be studying cryptography. But let's defer from that for a second. The difference between the state backing the currency and there being a central, digital or physical, the state still backs it. And I think that's kind of where people get lost in this whole idea of crypto versus cash versus CBDCs versus whatever. Is the goal isn't necessarily to have this physical or digital representation of what the state wants for its people. I think the point here is that people are trying to separate themselves from the state, being that they don't want their money intermediated upon, inflated by, or debased by the government. And deflation, debasement, they're essentially the same thing, but they don't want the government to be the function, the reason that the money has value. Now, you could say, and I've had this conversation recently, a lot of people say that the US dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, etc. The dollar was fundamentally backed by gold. Going to the reserve note point, the reason that there were Federal Reserve notes in the first place, got a little tongue sorry. The reason that there were Federal Reserve notes in the first place is simply to act as the transactory between, well, hey, I got gold, it's in the reserve, it's literally provable by this receipt, you can go cash this in for the gold that you want. Okay, so $1 of gold was $1 of gold. You could go buy that, gold ounce, I believe, and get an ounce of gold for $1. So, to anybody who would start by, starts from a position of money is arbitrarily valued, I think that's a misconception. The reason that the dollar was backed by gold and why gold was a strong currency to a strong, I guess, asset to back the dollar by was because there was work to be proven by mining gold. Okay, there was no way to make gold, to conjure gold up out of thin air, to make it simply. You had to go physically mine it, and people assign a value to what is most important in the economy. Okay, so if you're a gold miner and everybody is like, dang, this is a super rare, like this is the super rare element of the earth right now, we can't miss out on having a little bit, because everybody who has a little bit is like Caesar. Okay, well, we look forward, let's say 200 years, and we see there's been industrial revolution after technological revolution, right? So the position that gold would be worthless is just a lack of, it's myopic, to say the least. To think that gold wouldn't have a value, or there was no way to discover a value, would be foolish. So anybody who held on to their gold from the gold mining era was probably a borderline genius in the economic sense. Now, again, I say this value isn't arbitrary. So again, you have to get the tools necessary to mine the gold. You have to have the, probably at the time, like the I don't want to say permits, but have to talk to the right people, know where to go, etc. You had to do some research and figure out a lot to get to the gold. And what was that time worth to the people who putting their life on the line? Who's to say? It's priceless. That since they're driving demand in the economy, and the wealthy people that have the ability to purchase this gold are like, yo, I want it for a commodity, for what? Of course, gold already exists in the world, so people know what it is. It's just a matter of novelty in the region. It drove the demand up. So again, if you look today, gold is still an asset that is valid in every government. China has been on what I believe is a 9-month buying spree of gold. And so, and not to mention, gold can be used in aeronautics. It's not just a metal. People just don't necessarily talk about how much they use it. They try to minimize its value, try to minimize using it so that it retains its asset value and isn't as volatile, I would imagine. So there's that point. You still have currency that is influenced and backed by the state, bar none. There's no way for you to say that a dollar transacted just because you handed it to your friend behind the closed doors of the government. Well, that's what the IRS does. They verify how much money is moving through the city or the country at any given moment. And so you kind of find yourself in a paradoxical situation, because if you're not already going against the system and spending your money illegally, and I hope that's not what you're doing, but if you're already going that route, spending money where you shouldn't be, or going outside of the legalities to try to save a couple bucks here, they're still checking your paycheck. So unless you're making money off the books entirely, like that money can't be traced to the person who gave it to you, or the person, that money's still tracked. And we can talk about the printing and the counterfeiting. That's as far as the government's concerned, that's real money too. But just like there's lost Bitcoin, there's lost dollars, just not to inflation. So why choose a cryptocurrency? Specifically, let's say, why choose Bitcoin over a central bank digital currency? Well, let's stick with Bitcoin first. Bitcoin's fundamental utility is secrecy and peer-to-peer transactions. Not speed of transactions, not volume of transactions, none of that. None of that's relevant. It is the most secure, simplest to understand in terms of cryptos, I would imagine. As far as fundamentals, that is, of the crypto world. And so Bitcoin is not a cryptocurrency, it is the initial cryptocurrency that kind of set the tone for what a proper cryptocurrency looks like. Now, you could say, well, what about Silk Road? The government found that, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I think part of that process of learning how to use crypto properly is understanding the optimal way to use it, which is earn it, store it store it in a cold wallet, put your phrases in your head, and never talk about it again. Because what's likely to happen if you're a criminal is one thing, right? That's kind of the inherent insistence of Bitcoin, is that a majority of the network has to be operating in the betterment, in the better interest, in the best interest of the network for it to function properly. Now you can say, well, how do you guarantee that a majority of the people are going to act in the best interest of the network? By making their fundamental value a part of it. So that's why it's so beautiful that the Bitcoin network has validators, nodes that are external to the code itself. By having, so we could imagine, for people who aren't familiar, Bitcoin, the system, the underlying network works sort of like having, let's say there's an input. Once that input is delivered, everybody who's attached to that system that is a validator or whatever, a part of that entire infrastructure, they're going to get a copy of the transaction report, every single person. Now, what can happen is they can, as a majority, whatever that might take, decide that we want to invalidate this one transaction, because maybe it was necessary for some reason. But that would debase the entirety of the value of the whole structure, because the entire point would be for it, not to be modified, not to be changed, and not to be rehashed. So unless there was some critical failure with Bitcoin, where everybody who was attached to the network was subject to immediate death, I don't think that's ever going to be the case where they, as a group, as a majority, overturn the protocols of Bitcoin or work to go against the betterment, the best interests of Bitcoin. The only way that's going to happen is if you have singular individual bad actors who have a majority share in the 21 million Bitcoin. But even at that point, if they're only an individual and not a contingency, a group of people who are actively trying to debase Bitcoin or devalue it, then that individual will just see a majority of what he stored in wealth. Let's say they bought Bitcoin at 70K and now they've shrunk it down to 25. They're going to see all that wealth diminish. So what would be the purpose in that? There's virtually none. Except maybe to just say F you to the structure that exists. But even then, it would take a lot for just one person to do that. So, we've talked physical currencies in the barter system. We talked CBDCs and Bitcoin. Just like physical currency in a barter system has, no need for an intermediary, the fact that one was initiated is kind of, I would call that an extension of human necessity. That is an extension of consciousness, right? Because at the fundamental level, there's consciousness, and on top of that, there is freedom. So, people are free to do what they want, but that comes with the responsibility of accepting the actions that come from that. So, unintended consequences, intended consequences, all that. On top of that, we develop markets and free trade, because instead of killing each other for what we want, we should just trade each other for what we want. So let's figure out how we can make that work. And then on top of that, we develop the legal system to try to govern how trade is enacted, because obviously if you look at 1776, not all trade is in favor of the people that the export is being shipped to or shipped from. So why Bitcoin over a physical currency? Because that's, I think, the ultimate question. People assume that a physical currency is just an arbitrary value source. It's not. I don't think it ever has been. I don't think it ever will be. The reason that the value of money has diminished is because, at least in the United States, what was backing the currency was removed. So when Nixon removed the gold standard, that money was fake from the jump. Like that was really the nail in the coffin that did it. Now, with that transpiring and us kind of hoarding our gold reserves to that effect, it has put us in a precarious situation, because internationally our money is only backed by debt. So we're kind of at a max point of insolvency, and that's because we were able to inflate our currency so much, especially over the past few years of COVID. I think the amount of money printed was I could look real quick, but I want to say between 40 to 60%. The supply of money was increased. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it increased in the last 2 years more substantially than over the last like decade or 200 years or something like that. So you have to look at how that took place, and like I said, that was a direct effect from money being printed, money that we thought was really helpful to us at the time. Like, yo, I need that stimulus check, I need that PPP loan. But think about how much of that money that people ripped off and scammed. And I didn't pull any, I didn't touch any PPP money, but I know plenty of people who have claimed to have touched lots and lots of PPP money. And so it's like you have to really get a grasp of what's happening. Is that the moment there's a scam in the system, a loophole, an opportunity to exploit the system, people typically are going to jump on it. Now, with Bitcoin, we had the block wars, and that was a testament to Bitcoin's veracity and its tenacity in the system. Like, they wanted to try to do anything to maybe see if they could upset the Bitcoin network, and by just trying to light hack a light little, okay, let's see if we can make the block bigger. Like, no, it's not gonna happen. And it's not because it couldn't potentially happen in time. It's because the necessary resources to make it happen are exponential compared to anything we have available to us as a collective, not as individuals or institutions, because I'm sure there's some super powerful computers in individual institutions or under bases in the earth, but as a collective of people who are on the Bitcoin network, who are trying to mine Bitcoin and validate Bitcoin, validate Bitcoin transactions, that is, it would be very, very difficult to get every single one of us a quantum computer of some sort. And right now, just even in 100 to 200 years, the tech might not be there. But ultimately, the reason why you should not to get too long-winded, but the reason that Bitcoin retains its tenacity against real money is because it is secured in a vacuum, and it's very difficult to really quantify that in modern context. But no other store of value exists where your money can be protected through time and literal space. Once you move that crypto to a cold wallet, you can shoot it out into the deepest part of the galaxy, and whoever finds it is going to be able to access that crypto if they can access the Bitcoin network or something of that nature. So that should be an indication as to how. And even if let's say hypothetically that ledger lands on Mars without the phrase, because I mean, even if they wanted to hack that wallet, they would still need the phrase from the person who sent it. And so you could put your entire wealth out in the universe, and it only be accessible to whatever spacefarer can decrypt your 12 phrase key. But even then, that's so unlikely. And I think that's a huge problem with this situation, is that the introduction of technology has exponentially quantified what the basic mathematics would indicate to you as an intuition. So like, a lot of people will, I know that sounded like a fancy thing to say, a lot of people will summarize their calculations, plus or minus a margin of error, and assume that based on their understanding of math or mathematic principles, that they can roundabout give an answer as to what something will be worth, or what something will cost, or what something should be valued at. But with time is an accelerant, and so when time acts as the accelerant against technology and against money specifically, in the case of the US dollar, over time, because the money was designed, I can't say designed, but because after coming off the gold standard, there was nothing to balance the losses of the money. As time progressed and inflation grew and the purchasing power diminished, our money lost value. But because Bitcoin is built in a way that makes it scarce, and non-replicatable, irreproducible, it's almost impossible for the value not to go up. And with the scarcity being built into not only how many exist, but how many are able to be made at any given point in time, through halvings, you have to really start to understand that, and I say have to because it's necessary for you to wrap your head around this concept. You viewers, to wrap your head around the concept that math, it quantifies exponentially, and time quantifies exponentially, and things that happen that used to take 5 years take 2.5, and they shrink that down to 1.25, and that's how time moves. Eventually, even looking back at your youth, it's now a fraction of what you've lived as a person. And that's the scale in which technology evolves. That's the scale in which money should progress. Is that over time, this thing that was worth $100 an ounce should now be worth $10,000 an ounce, because over time either it's become more scarce or more people have bought it up and don't want to get rid of it. And that's exactly how Bitcoin is designed. It's inherently so that the value will go up. Money counter go burr type shit. So, summary: Bitcoin is not arbitrarily valued. And before I give up the whole summary, let me tell you why it's not just arbitrary. Not only is it cryptographically protected, right, and not only is it outside of the governmental control system, which is I would say, if there's a layer of value, the base layer of value to Bitcoin is those 2 points: is that it's not intermediated, and it's absolutely uncrackable. The layer on top of that makes it more valuable is that the required energy to develop or to produce any number of Bitcoin a day is relatively high. If you look at charts that show you the price to mine versus the price of, they will show you that only was there a very brief period where the price was like double or the cost was half the price. So you could mine for 4K and make a 9K bit, so that was a brief period. Now it's about even. It's it costs you roughly, at least in developed countries, or where electricity is averaged out, it's going to cost you a decent amount to make a Bitcoin. And so it requires not only elemental resources, electricity, water, cooling, etc. And if you're using gravitational forces like water dams, or if you're using wind turbines, or if you're using residual heat energy or solar, whatever, if you're using any of those resources, those are infinitely more expensive right now to make and maintain than a fossil fuel based, as far as production value, a fossil fuel based mine. But the reason that it is incumbent to go in a more reusable energy manner is because, again, as I said, over time, the difficulty of mining Bitcoin will increase exponentially. A quantum computer, even if the whole world had quantum computers, at a certain point, it might not be enough to actually attack the system in a feasible amount of time to make a change. And so, to the summary, Bitcoin has value based in its cryptography, its peer-to-peer transactionability, the fact that it is a layer of security in the environment. In other words, it's that you need economic resources, environmental resources to create it, so you're going to want to invest in those environmental resources to keep those things producing, so that production rate doesn't diminish. And it actually incentivizes infrastructure growth in those departments, in the sectors of AI, and in the sectors of tech, and in the sectors of energy and environmental health. All of those things kind of coalesce in creating Bitcoin. So ultimately, there's a few good reasons, but I would say that the best one, myself, and my personal philosophy, is that it is an unintermediated source of currency. So if I want to transact to you directly, I can, and I don't have to ask anybody how much I can send, how fast I can send it. It can go as fast as the Bitcoin network will allow it, and it will be a transaction that is relatively seamless outside of that little bit of a delay. And so for some people, the non-maximalists, the crypto enthusiasts, but the Bitcoin minimalists would say that it's all about transaction speeds, it's all about scalability, it's all about this, that, and the other. I think fundamentally that starts to get way in the weeds of what crypto, or specifically Bitcoin, and I guess the name cryptocurrency inherently are supposed to be about, which is cryptographic currency. And so just keep that in mind when you're having these discussions about Bitcoin or CBDCs, or what you think a crypto is. I encourage everybody to sit down and wrestle with the Bitcoin white paper to the degree that they understand it. And if they don't, go out and watch some videos, or even just come talk to me, hit me up on Facebook or Instagram or Discord. I'll talk to you about it in a way that I think is that we can kind of agree is maybe understandable, so that maybe you understand it better. But that's my take on this whole CBDC and cryptocurrency. Should I buy Bitcoin? Bitcoin's a scam position. Bitcoin isn't a scam. Bitcoin is probably one of the first technological advancements in money that we're gonna see over the next 100,000 years. And maybe at some point we do go back to physical currencies, but the physicality of it will have to be advanced to a degree that we probably can't comprehend right now. I know a lot of people, you see the pictures of the gold coins that are Bitcoins that are physical. Maybe at some point we make a computational disk, something like a floppy disk, where it's made of gold and silver and palladium, and you put it into a thing and it generates power because it has that much cryptographic energy withheld in it. It has 30,000 Bitcoins worth of cryptographic energy withheld in it, so it can power, let's say, some kind of intergalactic monolith, or you know what I'm saying. But that's so far-fetched. Granted, Bitcoin was probably far-fetched when it was just percolating as an idea, but it's a little bit more far-fetched than most people are willing to take the conversation. So for now, that's been me, initial thoughts on Cryptocurrently, and I'll catch you next time.